Encred knew he didn't have any special powers. He never did. He'd gotten this far with nothing but endless, brutal training. But in a real war, sometimes that just wasn't enough. An enemy soldier broke through his guard, sending him to the ground. The blade found its mark. He knew it was over. And just like that, it was his end. He knew he had no talent. He understood that his dream was probably impossible. But still, he fought. An arrow flew through the chaos. Even as men fell around him, he held on to one single hope. He didn't care if everyone laughed at him or said it would never come true. As long as there was a sword in his hand, he would become a knight. His dream was so worn out, and in a flash, it was over. The enemy's sword tore through his throat. The pain was sharp, burning. He choked on his own blood, his vision starting to fade. The soldier pulled his blade free without a second thought. Encred fell to his knees. He hadn't realized his death would be so pathetic. He felt everything fading to black. He wasn't on the battlefield anymore. He was kneeling in a strange, dark place. Encred's eyes shot open. He was back in his bunk, wondering if his death had just been a terrible dream. He sat up and saw one of his squad mates complaining about something in his boot. The man yelled in disgust. Turns out, it was a bug. But Encred wasn't paying attention to the bug. A strange feeling washed over him. It felt like he'd seen this exact moment before. His mind flashed back to the battlefield. He remembered the chaos, the sounds of swords clashing, and then he remembered the blade piercing his neck. This wasn't just a memory. This was the second time this day had happened. He died a third time, the same blade, the same spot, and then a fourth time. It just kept happening. He woke up to someone banging a pan. The memory was so real, he could still feel the burning pain in his throat. He remembered the enemy soldier standing over him. It was all coming together in his mind. This day, the fight was exactly the same as before. It just kept repeating over and over again. But this time, he was ready for it. He stared down the soldier who had taken his life again and again. But this time, the fear was gone. All that remained was a cold, sharp focus. The enemy soldier lunged forward, just like before. It was a perfect, deadly stab. He'd seen that exact blade coming for him 16 times already. This was number 17. But knowing what was coming didn't mean he could stop it. The sword slipped right past his defense. It went straight through his neck. His 17th death. He fell to the cracked earth, defeated once again. As everything went dark, his mind filled with regret. If only he'd swung his sword with a little more power. If only he'd trained just a little bit harder. The frustration was the last thing he felt. The battle raged on around his body. He was just another casualty on a field full of them. He found himself falling through a dark, empty space. He couldn't help but wonder if things could have been different. A single lantern glowed in the darkness, hanging from a chain. Then, a voice echoed through the void. It asked him if he really thought a little more effort would have changed anything. It was the Black River boatman. The shadowy figure told him to struggle, to feel the despair of hitting a wall he could never break through, and then just give up. Encred knelt there in the darkness, alone with those words. But instead of despair, something else sparked in his eyes. A cold, burning determination. And then, the loud clanging of a pan jolted him back to reality. The day had started over again. The sound of the pan was loud, but Encred was already awake. He lay there, his mind completely clear. One of his squad mates, Rem, was already getting dressed. He noticed Encred was up and seemed surprised he was awake so fast. But Encred wasn't surprised by anything. He calmly told Rem that there were bugs in his boots. Rem looked confused for a second. He shook his boot, and sure enough, a big bug fell out onto the floor. Without a second thought, he crushed it with his foot. Rem immediately got angry, thinking Encred had put it there as a prank. Encred just told him he'd seen it crawl in earlier and walked away, already focused on what was next. He glanced back at the dead bug. This was the 18th time he had seen it die. The 18th time this day had begun. He pulled back the curtain, looking out at the morning sky. He'd been swinging a sword since he was a kid, and he wondered if seeing this fight just a few more times would be enough to finally end this day. He remembered that same fire from when he was young, screaming as he swung his blade, and then he was back on the battlefield, facing the same soldier. This was the wall he had to break through, but this time was different, because he had repeated this day over and over. He had finally mastered the heart of the beast. He hadn't just been dying. He had been learning how to use that exact same killing thrust for himself. He gritted his teeth. He refused to give up. He remembered the tales of legendary knights. They were figures who could change the entire battlefield all by themselves. An invincible hero who could end a war. He used to think he was the hero of one of those stories. That's why he left his village, determined to become a knight. But the real world wasn't a story. The other mercenaries just laughed at him, making fun of how clumsy he was. They told him a coward who was scared of a stray dog could never be a knight. They said he wasn't even good enough to be a simple mercenary. After leaving his village and joining the mercenaries, he had to face a hard truth. He had no special talent at all, but he told himself it was too early to give up. He believed that hard work would never betray him. He was convinced that if he just put in enough time and enough effort, he could overcome it all. And slowly, it started to pay off. He gained experience. He earned the strength to be acknowledged by those around him. He could feel himself getting stronger. For the first time, he truly believed he could become a knight. But that strong hope he felt was about to be crushed. That hope he'd built up for so long started to shatter. He remembered a time when a kid in a village he was staying at asked him for a duel. The boy told him he was weak. He was only 12 years old and had been learning the sword for just 6 months. After more than a decade of training, his hands wrecked from holding a sword. He was completely pathetic compared to a genius. He wondered if all his hard work had been for nothing. Was there really no way for him to succeed? Everyone could laugh at him and call it a hopeless dream. He didn't care. He just spent less time eating and sleeping than anyone else and kept swinging his sword. He just kept swinging his sword over and over from dusk until dawn. Then one day, something inside him snapped. He screamed, putting every last bit of his strength into it. He swung the blade with everything he had. The sword cut through the air. He was completely out of breath, sweat pouring down his face. But even then, his eyes were sharp. His will wasn't broken. The tree he'd been practicing on was covered in scars. He looked at his sword, and a thought crossed his mind. Even if he could never become a knight. He paused for a moment to catch his breath, every muscle in his body aching, but he didn't stop. He just raised his sword and swung again. He put everything he had into every single strike. He knew he might never become a knight, but he told himself he could at least become an experienced soldier. He let out a final roaring shout, and with one last powerful swing, his training came to an end. 3 years passed in a flash. In the present, he was a soldier in the Cyprus Division. He'd been placed in the 4th Company, 4th Platoon, and at the very bottom of it all, the 4th Squad. After all that training, he became the squad commander of a second-rate unit. It was the best he could achieve, but he figured being a soldier was still better than being a traveling mercenary. He walked over to one of his squad mates, a man named Jackson. Jackson looked up, asking what he wanted. Encrid asked him to cover his morning duty rotation for the day. Jackson just stared for a moment, thinking it over. He agreed, but told Encrid he'd have to repay the favor next time. Just then, another squad mate, Rem, walked up. He commented on how intense Jackson was, comparing him to a wildcat. He then turned to Encrid with a grin, asking if he was about to try and push some work onto him too. But Encrid wasn't joking around. He looked Rem straight in the eye and said he wanted to learn the heart of the beast again. Rem just stared at him for a second, a little surprised by the sudden seriousness. Then a smirk spread across his face. He reminded Encrid that he'd already given up on learning it once, and asked why he thought this time would be any different. Encrid's mind flashed back to the battle. He remembered dying, and then waking up, forced to live the same day over and over again. Each time he came back to life, he'd learned the heart of the beast from Rem, but it was never enough to save him. The battlefield stretched out before them, 2 massive armies ready to clash once more. He let out a war cry, but his mind was crystal clear. This was his 21st time on this exact same battlefield. But this time, he wasn't fighting blindly. He had completely memorized this repeating disaster. He knew to dodge the spear that always came for his back, and he was ready for the sword strike from the guy right behind that one. He moved through the chaos like it was a dance he'd practiced 100 times. He knew the next person to watch for was a soldier from another squad named Vel. He saw Vel fighting. Encrid knew from all the other times that this guy was about to die. Just like clockwork, an arrow came flying right for him. But this time, Encrid was ready. He jumped in front of Vel and blocked the shot with his shield. It didn't matter. The moment the arrow was blocked, Vel went down anyway. An enemy soldier used the opening to leap right over him, aiming straight for Encrid. Encrid parried the attack, holding his ground. His first goal for the day was complete. He had tried to save Vel, but the man died instantly anyway. Still, he had done what he set out to do. With that out of the way, he focused on what was next. He moved without hesitation, taking down another enemy with a clean strike to the leg. The ground was littered with the bodies of fallen soldiers. And then, through the chaos, Encrid saw him, the same soldier as always. It didn't matter what Encrid did differently. He always ended up facing this man. This soldier had stabbed him in the neck and ended his life 20 times already. He took a slow, steadying breath. As the soldier lunged, Encrid made a promise to himself. This time, he would survive. His mind flashed back to his training with Rem. He remembered his instructor pointing out a fatal flaw. Rem had told him that he always closed his eyes in dangerous situations, a habit that would get him taken out. During one training session, Rem had swung his axe right at Encrid's head. He'd yelled that if Encrid flinched like that on a real battlefield, he'd be gone in an instant. Rem told him he had to be brave, to become someone who didn't even know what death was. He had to be like a beast. Back in the present, the enemy soldier lunged forward, just like he always did. Rem's words echoed in his mind. The heart of the beast, a beast who doesn't know death. Encrid asked himself if he was really afraid of it. The answer was no. After all, for him, death only made him stronger. The blade came right for his throat, just like it always did. But this time, he twisted his body with all his might. The cold steel scraped past his skin as the soldier's attack hit nothing but air. For the first time, today, on his 21st try, he had finally dodged the stab. But Encrid wasn't just defending anymore. He swung his own sword with everything he had, knocking the enemy's weapon right out of his hand. With the soldier defenseless, Encrid drove his sword forward without a moment's hesitation. The soldier's face was pure shock. He had no way to stop what was coming. Encrid's eyes were like ice. He was completely focused on ending it. His blade found the exact same spot where he had been struck 20 times before. He remembered the feeling all too well, the endless cycle of pain he'd been trapped in, and he remembered the voice that came after every single death. The shadowy figure on the boat always told him the same thing, to give up, accept that he was weak, and finally be at peace. Every single time, the offer to just quit was right there, waiting for him. He told that voice in his head that the day it wanted would never come. He had finally seen the tip of the enemy's sword, and he dodged it. And then, just like every other morning, the loud banging of a pan woke him up. Rem commented that he was up immediately, but Encrid was already thinking. He knew he was moving forward, one step at a time. This was his 22nd day. He was ready to challenge it all over again. But this wasn't his 22nd attempt. He was now on his 33rd try. After so many deaths, he could finally see the enemy's attack clearly. He met the soldier's blade, holding his ground. This time, he was sure he could dodge it before the sword even reached him. But he was wrong. The soldier was just too fast. He never stood a chance. And just like that, another day ended. And so, he died again. The blade found his neck, just like all the times before. As he fell, the amulet he always wore swung free. It hit the dirt. That amulet. It was the source of everything. He remembered where he got it. Back when he was a mercenary, he'd sometimes take requests to deal with monsters. He wasn't doing it for some grand reason. He just happened to pass by a village that needed help. The real reason he helped them was simple. His dream was to become a knight, and protecting the weak was what knights were supposed to do. The villagers were poor, but they offered him what they could as thanks. He just listened, taking in their gratitude. It was a charm, a simple blue amulet that would change his life forever. The villager had told him it was a laughable reward for risking his life, but that the charm would grant whatever he desperately prayed for. Lying there, dying again, it all clicked. He wondered if this amulet was making the day repeat itself, just so he could become a knight. He remembered the soldier looking down on him, saying he must be in a lot of pain. The soldier raised his blade, offering what he called mercy, but Encrid didn't see it that way. He was furious. The soldier just stared down at him, his eye glowing red from inside the helmet. To Encrid, this wasn't mercy. This was just a guy who enjoyed hurting people. And then, the sword came down, ending his life once more. And just like that, the day began again, with the same loud banging of a pan. This time though, Encrid had a plan. He calmly told Rem he'd put an insect in his boot, making the big man jump back in surprise. Rem was furious. yelling at Encrid and asking if he'd finally lost his mind. He told Encrid to stop messing around and come outside, crushing the bug under his boot. But Encrid wasn't playing. He looked Rem dead in the eye and asked him to teach him the heart of the beast. Rem was completely caught off guard. Without another word, Rem grabbed his axe. Encrid watched, his focus absolute. He was ready to learn. Rem didn't hold back. He brought the butt of his axe down hard. The blow landed right in Encrid's chest, knocking the wind out of him. But Rem didn't look satisfied. He looked confused. He asked how Encrid had suddenly gotten so tough. Encrid just said he'd trained, but he knew the real reason. He'd already done this exact training more than 10 times. He couldn't exactly tell Rem that he'd learned his family's secret technique in a future that hadn't happened. He just told himself it was a feeling he'd learned from dying. He brushed off Rem's questions, saying it didn't matter how he knew it. Instead, he just walked over to the weapon rack. He picked up a sword and calmly asked for another round of sparring. Rem just stood there for a second, sizing him up. A grin spread across his face. Encrid knew that even with the heart of the beast, he was useless if he couldn't actually land a hit. But Encrid didn't attack. He just dodged, again and again. Rem started getting annoyed, yelling at him to stop running and fight back. He pressed forward, not giving Encrid a single moment to breathe. Ducking under another swing, Encrid knew it was time. He only had one sword technique he could rely on. He steadied his breathing, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He was using the Valen mercenary sword technique. It was a strange style created by a mercenary, and most people looked down on it as just a petty trick. Rem knew his lower body was weak, but this was the only decent technique Encrid had. So Encrid planted his foot, ready to commit everything to this one move. As Rem's axe came crashing down, Encrid dropped low to the ground, and Rem saw it. He saw the absolute focus in Encrid's eyes. He drove his blade forward with everything he had. Their weapons met with a loud clang, but Rem's axe easily knocked Encrid's sword aside. He was completely open. Encrid admitted that for a second, he'd copied the stab that had killed him more than 10 times. His body just remembered the move. He clenched his fist, thinking it over. But Rem's feedback wasn't what he expected. He complained that the move was missing something. It should have drawn blood. He told Encrid that out of everything he'd shown him, that stab was the most decent one. The problem was, it didn't have any real impact. Rem yelled that for a strike like that to be real, Encrid's own hand should have been bleeding from the force. Encrid just listened, taking it all in. Rem finally put his finger on it. The problem wasn't the move itself. He told Encrid that he was just too doubtful of himself. And he was right. Encrid was always thinking about what would happen if his attack failed, what he should do if it got blocked. Rem told him to stop thinking like that. He needed to go in with the mindset that the enemy was already dead meat. Encrid stood there, letting the words sink in. Rem's explanation was rough, but he understood exactly what he meant. He finally saw the real difference between his stab and the one that kept taking him down. That soldier had no doubts. There was only the absolute certainty that his blade would find its mark. He remembered the moment of his death clearly. The enemy soldier stood over him, and Encrid finally understood why he always lost. He just didn't have any confidence in his own sword. But looking up at that blade now, something was different. He wasn't afraid anymore. He knew what he had to do. He had to stab with the absolute intent to finish his opponent. Back in the present, he put all of that realization into one powerful swing. But Rem was just on another level. He dodged it without breaking a sweat. Then he grinned, throwing the enemy's own words right back in Encrid's face. But it didn't matter. Encrid just kept moving forward, one step at a time. This was how he'd get stronger. Encrid refused to back down. He just kept attacking, no matter how many times Rem easily blocked him. The cycle began all over again. Back on the battlefield, he promised himself he would advance, even if it was just by a little bit. Day after day, he fought and fell. On the 111th day, the result was the same. By the 123rd day, he was still getting back up, learning something new from every single loss. The enemy's mocking words were a constant echo, repeated with every final blow. And then, on the 124th day, something finally changed on. This time, he wasn't just defending. He was attacking with everything he had learned. He poured every last bit of his strength into the push. For the first time, Rem looked completely stunned. He grit his teeth, refusing to give an inch. Their weapons were locked together. Rem couldn't understand it. He thought Encrid had completely lost his mind, but the force of it was tearing his hands apart. Blood started to drip down the blade of his sword. Encrid's grin was the only answer Rem freedom needed. The pain in his hands didn't matter at all. He was finally getting stronger. He had to attack with the pure intent to finish his opponent. That was the only way. He remembered the scene perfectly. The soldier would charge forward, sword raised high. Encred would meet the attack, gripping his own sword with all his might. Their blades would crash together in a shower of sparks. But his first try was a failure. The enemy's sword found his neck every time. Even as he fell, he forced himself not to blink, absorbing every detail. He swore he would never let go of his sword. This was how he would finally break through the wall. He remembered everything. Every clash of swords, every stab, every single failure was burned into his mind. The soldier kicked him hard, sending him sprawling to the ground. The soldier looked down at him, breathing hard. He mocked Encred, saying he looked like he was suffering. He raised his sword, calling this final strike an act of mercy. He promised him that tomorrow he was going to die. A cruel grin spread across the soldier's face. Then he corrected himself, saying the dead have no tomorrow. The blade plunged into Encred's neck. The amulet glowed, and everything started over. He woke up again. He was already up and walking through the barracks. One of the soldiers mentioned he'd just seen him come in. As Encred passed, another squad mate casually told him to take his guard duty as thanks. The soldier watched him go, confused. This was the 125th time this day had repeated. Encred walked outside and found Kreis, calling him by his nickname, Big Eyes. Without stopping, he ordered Kreis to get him shin armor, a shield, and a dagger, promising to pay him back later. Kreis complained about the favor, but agreed to do it. He'd never seen his squad commander act so pushy before. One of the female squad mates called out the others for being lazy, threatening one of them with her axe. The rest of the squad watched him, completely confused. They all agreed he was acting really weird today, but it wasn't weird. It was a new kind of intensity. Without wasting a moment, he started training, slamming his sword against a shield. He pushed through the exhaustion. He remembered the incredible pain of every death, wondering if he could really win if it took thousands of tries. He thought about just trying to escape and survive. Would that finally let him see tomorrow? But he quickly shut that thought down. He was stronger now, but being content with that just wasn't an option for him. He had to get past this wall. There was no other choice. He stood before his opponent. This wasn't just another soldier. This was the wall he had to overcome. But he was different now. After repeating the same day so many times, he had finally mastered the heart of the beast. He'd also learned how to stab properly. He now understood the true intent needed to finish an opponent. He refused to abandon this power. To him, this endless cycle wasn't a curse at all. It was a blessing. He brought his sword down with everything he had. The soldier's armor shattered on impact. He stood ready, his expression firm. He knew he had to keep moving forward, no matter what. All around him, soldiers were getting ready for the next fight. His squad mates were a strange bunch, each one a master in their own right. He stood among them, a completely different man than he was before. The battle raged on, a sea of clashing swords and shields. He knew he had no special skills. He thought about how he'd managed to survive this long. It all came down to three things: preparation, luck, and keeping a cool head. But it was never that simple. The battlefield was full of variables. He remembered every single death. On the 46th day, a mace shattered his shoulder. The next day, he dodged it, only to have his head crushed by someone else, so he adapted. He learned to add a spin to his attack, taking out the first guy before he could even strike. On the 71st day, it was something different. A soldier down low managed to cut his foot, leaving him completely helpless against his main target. Every failure was a lesson burned into his memory. He learned how to deal with that soldier too. Then there was the axe thrower. On the 89th day, a thrown axe split his head open. He realized if he let that man live, he would never reach his target. After so many repeated days, throwing a weapon was second nature to him now. He threw his own blade before the man could even raise his axe, taking him out of the fight for good. He had cleared every single obstacle he'd memorized. The path was finally open. But just as he thought he was clear, he felt it. His main target, the soldier named Vel, was right behind him. But just as he thought the path was clear, an arrow slammed into his shield. A new enemy had appeared, a sharpshooter known as the Claw of the Hawk. Encred didn't have time to deal with him. The chaos of the battle raged around him. His target, Vel, stood ready. This was it. This was the wall he had to break through. The soldier charged forward, cutting a path straight through the battle. His eyes burned with a single purpose. Encred met that intensity with his own cold focus. The rest of the battle seemed to fade away. It was just the two of them now. Vel closed the distance in an instant. His blade aimed to finish it. Encred met the downward slash with his shield, the impact rattling his entire arm. Vel realized that just dodging and stabbing wouldn't give him a chance to win. A direct fight was his only option. He couldn't believe it. Encred was supposed to be a regular soldier, but he fought with the strength of a prodigy. But Encred was one step ahead. He had faked the charge, knowing his opponent lacked real fighting experience and would be easily surprised. He knew the Valen mercenary sword technique, with all its variations, would be effective against someone like this. Instead of using his blade, he slammed the hilt of his sword right into Vel's face. The soldier stumbled back, completely thrown off balance by the unexpected hit. Before Vel could recover, Encred drove his foot hard into his chest, sending him flying. He didn't give him a single moment to breathe. The soldier was falling, completely open, and Encred brought his sword down with all his strength. He stood there for a moment, the battle raging around him, but there was no time to rest. The fight wasn't over. That's when he locked eyes with another soldier. But this time, Encred wasn't just reacting. He knew exactly what was coming. After dying to that same move over 100 times, he knew everything there was to know about that stab. He put every ounce of his focus into the attack. Their blades met in a flash of steel. But this time, the soldier's sword couldn't take the force. It shattered into pieces as Encred pushed forward, his strength completely overwhelming. But on the battlefield, there are always more threats. An arrow was already flying right for him. In the middle of all this, dodging an attack from a sharpshooter was almost impossible. But just before it hit, someone reached out to stop it. It was Rem's axe. He had thrown it just in time. Encred looked up from the ground. He had survived. He had won. The sharpshooter, known as the Claw of the Hawk, had a perfect shot lined up, but Rem's axe was already spinning through the air. It smashed the arrow into splinters, and it didn't stop there. The axe flew on and found its target. Rem was already charging, screaming that he was going to take down the sharpshooter, but his comrade told him to save his energy. It was already over, because while his squad had his back, Encred had finished his own fight. He drove his sword straight through the enemy soldier. The soldier's eyes went wide. The blade tore right through his neck, but his fight was just one part of the war. All around them, the chaos raged on. Christ stared up at his squad leader, completely stunned. Suddenly, a massive shockwave ripped across the field. Encred gasped for air. He'd pushed his body to its absolute limit, but Christ couldn't look away from him. He looked down at the man who had been his wall for so long. After 124 days of repeating the same fight, he had finally broken through. He looked down at the man he had finally beaten. He wasn't going to finish him. Instead, he just turned and walked away, leaving him on the ground. A wild look crossed his face. Something inside him had just shattered. He felt it deep in his soul. After all this time, he had finally broken through the wall that held him back. But the battle wasn't over. He snapped his head around, looking for the next enemy. Without wasting a second, he threw himself back into the chaos. He moved differently now, cutting a path through the enemy soldiers. One of his squad mates watched from a distance, completely stunned. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. The soldier who was watching Encred suddenly shouted, pointing at a new threat. He was screaming that it looked like some kind of giant frog. And there it was. A creature with blue skin and glowing red eyes stood in the middle of the chaos. It didn't move, just stared them down with a dangerous look. The blue-skinned creature stood over a fallen soldier who could only groan in pain. It looked down at one of its own dead warriors, saying it had invested a lot in raising him. The creature couldn't believe someone like Encred was the one who took him down. Encred was on the ground, completely out of breath. He'd used up everything he had. Seeing his chance, the creature raised its weapon to finish Encred off. The massive blade swung down in a blur, but just before it hit, Rem launched himself forward, blocking the attack with his own axe. The two weapons crashed together with incredible force, sending sparks flying. Rem gritted his teeth, pouring every bit of strength he had into his axe to hold the creature back. But the frog creature didn't even seem to be trying. It just stared down at him, unimpressed. The stalemate didn't last. A single push sent Rem flying backward through the air. Seeing an opening, another enemy soldier charged forward, aiming his spear right at Encred. But before the spear could land, Jackson was there, blocking the attack with his own blade. Meanwhile, Rem hit the ground hard. The frog creature, having dealt with him, was already moving again. It leaped into the air, ready to bring its weapon down on the defenseless Rem. But suddenly, Kreis was there, blocking its path with a smile. He told the creature that if it wanted to touch their squad commander, it needed his permission first. The frog creature looked down, confused. It couldn't understand why a weakling was the commander, and not one of the stronger fighters. Rem watched from the ground, knowing this was a warrior from the frog race, born to fight. He figured there were only two ways to win: burn it with magic, or pierce its heart in one perfect strike. The creature continued to stare past everyone else. It wondered why someone so powerful was on a battlefield this small. Rem's expression grew serious. He knew that to take this enemy down, he'd have to put his life on the line. But then, the frog warrior made a decision. It decided this fight wasn't worth it. It turned its back on Kreis, completely ignoring his challenge. Without another word, the creature simply walked away from the fight. Rem got to his feet, furious. He yelled after the warrior, calling it a coward, but the battle wasn't over. With the frog warrior gone, Kreis immediately leaped back into the fight. His sword swing sent an enemy soldier flying. It wasn't just him. The whole squad moved at once, tearing through the enemy lines. They were completely outmatched. Kreis didn't even seem to be trying hard. On the other side of the fight, Auden swung his massive sword. The impact was devastating, cutting the soldier down instantly. Everywhere you looked, Encrid's squad was wiping out what was left of the enemy forces. In a matter of moments, it was over. They stood together, a team of monsters on the battlefield. Encrid watched as the enemy's formation completely fell apart. Their commander screamed for his men to fall back. He slowly closed his eyes, the sounds of battle fading. It was a total rout. The enemy turned and ran, and just like that, the world dissolved into darkness. He found himself floating in that familiar, empty space. A voice echoed around him, saying he'd only managed to survive one day, and that was it. The Black River boatman was there, warning him that he wouldn't be able to handle the walls that were still to come. He told Encrid that his fate was to fall into despair and give up. But as Encrid listened, he quietly questioned that very idea. But Encrid wasn't broken. He pushed himself up from the ground, clenching his fist. Slowly, he got back on his feet. He looked right at the boatman and told him that walls exist for a reason. They exist to be overcome. The boatman just smiled. He said he'd be waiting for the moment when that ambition in Encrid's eyes finally died. Then, Encrid's eyes opened. The dream was over. He was covered in bandages, lying in a bed. He looked up, trying to figure out where he was. He recognized it immediately. He was in the infirmary tent. A voice cut through the haze. It was Rem, one of his squad mates. He told Encrid he'd been sleeping for 2 straight days. Rem tried to remind him what happened, saying he was the one who'd saved him from a giant frog. The memory was a blur. Encrid could hardly believe he'd made it out of that fight alive. Rem told him his bones weren't broken, but his head was shaken up pretty badly. Then he jokingly asked if Encrid still remembered his best friend. Encrid wasn't playing along. He told Rem they were never friends, and called him a noble hunter. That one comment completely changed Rem's mood. He grabbed Encrid's face and told him to shut up. The entire infirmary tent went quiet. Neither of them moved. Encrid looked him dead in the eye. He asked Rem why he was so angry about a secret if he was just going to call himself his best friend. He was forcing him to choose one or the other. He had finally made it. A new day. Beyond the today that had trapped him for so long. He was alive. Another voice cut in. It was Kreis. He told Encrid that getting him into the infirmary cost a lot, and he expected to be paid back 3 times over. Encrid finally understood. A regular soldier like him would never have ended up in a proper infirmary tent otherwise. He then pointed out that, as usual, Kreis was nowhere to be seen during the actual battle. Kreis just grinned. He offered a special discount, saying Encrid only had to pay him back double. As evening fell, the camp settled down. A new visitor appeared outside the tent. It was Jackson, another member of the 4th squad. Jackson didn't waste any time. He just asked Encrid what he wanted and told him to speak up. Without a word, Jackson tossed a small container onto the bed. As he walked out, he told Encrid to apply it twice a day and not to ask where he got it. Encrid was surprised. He recognized it as the same ointment Jackson always used, and everyone knew Jackson hated sharing his personal things. He wasn't the only one recovering in that tent. Nearby, another soldier was quietly weeping, and on his other side, Auden the gentle giant of their squad, watched over him in silence. Encrid finally spoke, telling them to just go. He insisted he wasn't dead. The tent grew quiet as night settled in. He lay there, wondering why they were all taking turns watching him. Before, they'd always just done their own thing. Something had definitely changed. He wondered if it was possible. Were they actually worried about him? Just then, the tent flap opened, and someone walked in. Encrid looked up, surprised to see who it was. It was Ragna. He casually asked what the commander was doing in the infirmary. He took a big bite out of an apple, looking completely unconcerned. Encrid immediately dismissed the thought. There was no way Ragna was actually worried about him. He glanced around the tent. Besides him, there were 2 other soldiers recovering. One of them was a platoon commander from another company, a guy he used to fight with. The man glared back, demanding to know what he was looking at. The other soldier was a guy he didn't know, who just sat there quietly, staring off into the distance. He looked like a regular soldier. Encrid wondered how he ended up in here. Suddenly, Encrid's eyes flickered towards the entrance. The blonde soldier looked over too. Someone was coming in. A tall figure in armor stepped through the tent flap. Encrid noticed her ears were long and pointed. She was an elf. She stood there, helmet under her arm, with the calm confidence of a commander. Her presence changed the entire feeling in the tent. She looked around the tent and asked who was in charge of the 444th squad. Encrid just looked back at her, confused. He was the commander she was looking for. The air in the tent was thick with tension. Everyone just stared at the elf commander, waiting. The platoon commander from the other company just stared, muttering in disbelief about her being a fairy. Trying to sound important, he quickly introduced himself as Vengeance, platoon commander from the second company. She wasn't impressed. Her eyes narrowed as she coldly asked if his company taught him to point out someone's race when addressing a superior officer. He immediately flinched and lowered his head, stammering an apology. Encrid watched the whole thing. A superior. That's when it clicked. She had to be the new commander of the 4th company. With that settled, he sat up and looked her straight in the eye. He introduced himself as Encrid, the commander of the 4th squad. She told Encrid she'd heard he was leading his difficult squad well. She said she was looking forward to what he could do, and with that, she turned to leave. Encrid was stunned. That's all that she came to say. But just as she reached the tent flap, a voice from behind her told her to stop. The commander turned around. It was Ragna, sitting on the other bed. She looked at him and asked for his name. Ragna hesitated for a second, then gave a nervous smile. He told her his name was Krang. Encrid watched, completely baffled. It sounded like Ragna just made that name up on the spot. His attitude was terrible for someone talking to a company commander. The commander didn't get angry. She just stared at Ragna for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out of the tent. Encrid watched her go, feeling like he'd just missed something important. Encrid was left trying to figure out what that was all about. The next morning, the sun rose over the camp. Back in the tent, Encrid slowly clenched his fist. He could feel his strength returning. Most of the pain was gone. He decided it was time to start training again. As he got ready to leave, the platoon commander from the other bed asked where he was going. Encrid told him he was heading to the training area. The commander just scoffed, calling him an idiot for trying to act tough. Ragna sat nearby, watching the whole thing without saying a word. He was using a special method he'd spent a lot of money to learn when he was younger. He replayed the final moments of the fight, wondering what would have happened if his last attack had failed. He realized he was putting all his faith in a single move. If that one attack didn't work, he would die. He remembered the other enemies, how even a simple axe could be lethal. He had to have a plan for what came next. He stood there, completely absorbed in replaying the fight. A voice suddenly broke his focus. It was Ragna. He asked what Encrid was doing, saying his hands had been twitching in the barracks, and now he was just spacing out. Encrid explained that the twitching was to train his grip strength, and he wasn't spacing out. He was replaying the battle in his head. Ragna asked why he was doing all this. Encrid's answer was simple, so he wouldn't get taken down in the next fight. But Ragna wasn't satisfied with that. He asked if Encrid actually wanted to become something by staying alive. He knew it was a long shot, especially with his limited talent, but it was a dream he had never stopped chasing. He wanted to become a knight. Ragna didn't laugh. He just sat there, completely silent. Encrid couldn't believe it. He told Ragna that this was a first for him. When Ragna asked what he meant, Encrid explained that he was the only person who hadn't laughed. Ragna leaned forward, saying he'd just remembered something important. He explained that watching Encrid had shown him what he needed to do. With that, He turned and walked away. Encrid just stood there, completely stunned. Ragnar glanced back with a small smile. He told Encrid to remember his name when he finally became a knight. It was the first time Encrid felt like someone was actually rooting for him. The next morning, the camp was already starting to wake up. A minstrel was singing songs for the soldiers, asking who the hero of the battlefield was. They all cheered back the name Cyprus. Encrid woke up to the usual sounds of the camp, a minstrel singing and soldiers complaining that breakfast was late again. Instead of heading straight for the training grounds, he decided to take a short walk. A nearby soldier looked up and asked how his injuries were holding up. He told the other soldier that the medicine was working well and thanked him for it. Jackson just told him that if he was really thankful, he should hurry up and get back to the squad. Then he walked away without another word. Night fell and the tent grew quiet. From across the tent, one of the other soldiers wished him good night. Encrid replied back, saying that sleeping early was pretty much all he did these days. Another soldier in the tent grumbled at them to shut up. The day ended quietly, with nothing but rest. The next morning, Encrid was woken up by the same familiar sounds. A minstrel was outside, singing praises for the hero of the battlefield, Cyprus. Encrid sat up, annoyed that the singer was back again. The soldiers started shouting about the rations again. Encrid realized he was saying the exact same thing as yesterday. That's when it hit him. It couldn't be possible. He looked outside and saw Jackson, who asked him how his injuries were. Encrid gave the same answer as before, telling him the medicine worked well. And just like yesterday, Jackson told him to hurry up and get back to the squad. There was no doubt. He was living the same day all over again. He remembered the voice from his dream. The boatman had warned him that another wall was coming. This was it. He died without even noticing what happened. This death felt even more hopeless than being stabbed. He stood there for a moment, trying to piece it all together. But instead of despair, a new fire lit up inside him. This was just another challenge. He was back in the real world, under the night sky. The tent was quiet, lit by a single candle. Lying in his bed, he started to think. To get to him here, the enemy would have to get through all the camp's defenses. Only a knight could do that. But that seemed unlikely. It had to be a hidden assassin, someone who knew the camp and could conceal their presence, someone who was an expert in taking people out. His mind raced. He remembered the elf commander. Her quiet, nimble movements would be perfect for this kind of work. He realized her visit earlier that day wasn't an inspection. She was scouting the location for the attack. He came up with a simple plan. There was only one entrance to the medical tent. The moment he saw her, he'd scream and wake the entire camp. All he had to do now was wait. He lay there, eyes fixed on the entrance, not moving a muscle. Then he saw it. A tiny glint of light, a poisonous needle. It hit him before he could even make a sound. He never saw the assassin move. A sharp pain shot through his body. He collapsed to the floor, completely paralyzed. He couldn't move or even speak. The poison was powerful, numbing his entire body. He finally understood. This must have been how he died last time, without ever knowing why. He looked over at the other beds. Platoon Commander Vengeance was already down, a needle sticking out of his neck. He then saw the assassin, a cloaked figure, moving toward the other soldier, Krang. The soldier's eyes shot open. He recognized the figure standing over him and was filled with terror. The assassin raised a short sword, ready to finish the job. The blade plunged deep into the commander's chest. His eyes were wide open, but there was no life left in them. Encrid could only watch, paralyzed and filled with rage. He couldn't do a single thing to stop it. Suddenly, another blade flashed through the tent. Encrid's eyes widened in horror. It wasn't just one attacker. There was another assassin. He was still completely paralyzed, unable to do anything but watch. But just as the blade was about to strike, a hand shot out of nowhere. It grabbed the assassin's wrist, stopping the attack cold. Encrid finally saw who it was. The elf commander had returned. The company leader stared down the assassin, her expression like ice. And then, he was somewhere else. He could hear soldiers chanting the name of a battlefield hero, Cyprus. But it was just a memory. He was back in his tent. He had woken up to the same morning 3 times in a row. He thought back to what happened. He was on high alert, but he couldn't even sense the assassin's presence. This wasn't going to be easy, and there was another problem. Even if he somehow managed to stop the assassins, he'd still have to deal with the company commander. Faced with 2 impossible tasks, he felt completely helpless. It was the same crushing feeling he'd had just a few days ago. But even then, he hadn't given up. He remembered the feeling of winning. He knew he would find a way to get through this too. The key was to never, ever give up. Suddenly, he had an idea. He walked over to another soldier's bed and ripped the blanket right off him. The man shot up, yelling and asking if Encrid had lost his mind. Encrid ignored him, explaining that if assassins weren't already inside, he needed to be ready for an attack from the outside. The soldier just laughed, asking if he was planning to hunt bugs with his sword. He smirked, saying it seemed like a fitting activity for a bunch of low-life soldiers anyway. Encrid replied that he didn't know the man cared so much about him. His squad mate just got angrier, shouting that he was obviously being sarcastic. With a sigh, Encrid said he was being sarcastic too. The soldier just screamed at him to get lost. Just then, a voice cut through the argument. A blonde man was standing at the entrance to the tent. He peeked inside with a smirk, asking if he should come back later. Encrid waved him in, muttering about how annoying everyone was. As the man walked past, Encrid watched him closely. He was almost certain the assassins had been after this guy. He was definitely suspicious, but Encrid had no idea who he really was. Still, he decided not to push. He wasn't going to dig into secrets someone clearly wanted to keep hidden. After all, he treated all the other crazy guys in his squad the same way. But then he thought about Krang. Since he'd been dragged into this assassination attempt, he figured he had the right to ask a few questions. So Encrid just came right out and asked him. He wanted to know who this guy really was. The question caught Ragna completely off guard. Encrid wondered if maybe he'd been too blunt, comparing his own conversational skills to Rem's. Ragna repeated the question to himself, trying to figure out what to say. Finally, he just told Encrid that it wasn't something he could share. Encrid asked why not, but Ragna just said it was a long story. Encrid didn't push it any further. He sat down on the edge of the bed, ready to drop it. But that's when he noticed something strange. But just as Encrid was about to let it go, another soldier in the tent exploded. He yelled at Encrid for not pushing harder, furious that he would ask such a big question and then just accept a vague answer. Then, the soldier turned his attention to Ragna. He started shouting, accusing him of being a spy based on his bad manners. Ragna just listened, not a single muscle on his face moving. His complete silence seemed to throw the soldier off more than any argument could have. Without saying a word, Ragna started to walk. He moved right past the soldier, who could only stand there and watch him go. Then, looking down at him, Ragna calmly stated that he had never betrayed the kingdom, and he never would. Encrid watched the whole thing unfold. He could see it in Ragna's eyes, and the way he moved. The man was telling the truth, the way Ragna carried himself. Encrid realized it was the aura of a true knight. The soldier couldn't believe it. He yelled at Ragna, questioning how he could speak so disrespectfully to a superior officer. Encrid's mind was racing, putting the pieces together. He thought about Krang. He wasn't a knight either. He'd been just as helpless against the assassin, but Ragna was different. Encrid was sure of it now. The man was definitely hiding something. Later that night, the barracks finally settled down. Someone wished Encrid a good night. Encrid replied, and soon the only sound was the quiet breathing of sleeping soldiers. But not everyone was asleep. One soldier watched the man who had yelled earlier. He was being strangely calm, and the soldier wondered if the confrontation with Krang had actually scared him. Encrid was also wide awake. His mind was still turning, trying to make sense of everything he'd seen. He knew that if the assassins made it inside this tent, it would be a slaughter. He grabbed his sword and quietly got up. He wasn't going to just sit there and wait for them, but Encrid wasn't the only one awake. Ragna had been watching him the whole time, and he asked what he was doing instead of sleeping. Encrid turned to him, his expression dead serious. He warned Ragna that assassins were about to invade the tent, and that he needed to cooperate if he wanted to survive. Ragna just stared at him, trying to figure out if he was serious. He scoffed, telling Encrid he must be crazy, and laid back down. He closed his eyes with a small smile, as if dismissing the whole thing. Encrid wasn't surprised by the reaction, but he wondered how Ragna had noticed him in the first place. It just confirmed his suspicions. This man was no ordinary soldier. Just then, Encrid's eyes shot open. He sensed it, but it was too late. A sword burst through his neck from behind. One of the other soldiers looked on in pure shock. Encrid couldn't even process when it had happened. That's when he saw the other assassin move. It was Ragna. The man who had just laughed at him was now cutting down their squad mates without a second thought. As his vision faded, everything went black. Encrid shot up in his bed. This was his fourth death. He realized he couldn't get help from Vengeance or Krang this time. Without any proof that assassins were coming, no one would believe him. He tried to warn the others, but they just thought he was insane insane. One of them even threatened to shut him up permanently. He was on his own, so he came up with a new idea. He would predict the exact moment the assassins arrived and scream for help just before they attacked. He waited in the dark, watching the camp for any sign of movement. He held his breath, trying to get the timing just right. He finally picked his moment and opened his mouth to scream, but a blade was already at his throat, and just like that, he was back. This was his 5th death. He finally understood that getting help was impossible. He had to ambush them and take them down himself. He decided to ambush them himself, but the moment he stepped out, something flew past him in the dark. It was a poison needle, and it hit him before he even knew what was happening. He wondered how he was supposed to fight an enemy he couldn't even see. While he couldn't see a thing, he knew they could see his every move. He realized that as long as he couldn't avoid that first poison needle, he would just die over and over without ever getting the chance to fight back. Then, the sound of soldiers cheering echoed through the camp as a new day began. Encrid's hand tightened around his sword. It was the 20th morning, and he hadn't been able to do a single thing. He had failed 20 times in a row. The frustration was starting to build, but instead of breaking, a small smile formed on his face. The frustration was gone. This was just another wall to break. He told himself he had only died 20 times. For him, that wasn't a sign of failure. It was just the beginning. He knew he had to solve the first problem before anything else, the poison needle. Once he could avoid that, he could figure out how to fight back. He needed a way to avoid attacks faster than the enemy could even see. His eyes fell on one of his squad mates, Jackson, the master assassin of his squad. He was the answer. Encrid must have muttered something because Rem stopped his training. He asked why Encrid was calling Jackson a perverted wildcat. Rem corrected him, saying that's what everyone calls Jackson. He explained it was because the man was a dirty pervert. Rem went on, explaining that Jackson never fights his enemies head-on. He prefers to stab them in the back and then just run away. Just then, Jackson himself walked up to them, calling out to his squad commander. He asked if Encrid's injuries were okay. Then he added that he could probably take care of the assassins without any trouble. Encrid knew that was true, but he couldn't just ask Jackson to protect him. He didn't have the authority, and even if he did, this was a wall he had to climb by himself. He looked at Jackson and made a decision. If he couldn't bring Jackson with him, then he would just have to become Jackson. He asked him a simple question. If someone like Jackson were to try and stab him in the back, what would he have to do to stop it? Jackson didn't answer right away. He just stood there, thinking. Jackson's answer was simple and terrifying. He said he wasn't sure, because no one had ever survived his ambushes before. That kind of answer would have scared anyone else. But Encrid just smiled. This was the exact kind of wall he was looking for. But Encrid didn't even flinch. He watched Encrid, seeming to realize this wasn't just a casual question. He let out a long sigh, almost like he was giving in. Finally, he gave him a real answer. To stop an assassin, you'd need eyes on the back of your head. Encrid listened, completely focused. That was it. That was the key. Encrid was confused. He had no idea what that was supposed to mean. Instead of explaining, Jackson decided to show him. He pointed into the distance and asked Encrid if he saw the wagon. He specified it was the one far behind the tents. Encrid could barely see it. He couldn't believe Jackson had noticed something so far away and started to wonder if the man was being literal. Then, Jackson calmly stated that the wagon was about to fall apart. A moment later, a loud crack echoed through the camp. The wagon's wheel snapped, and the whole thing collapsed. Jackson didn't even seem surprised. He had known it was coming. Encrid was speechless. He jokingly asked if Jackson could see the future, then demanded to know how he really did it. Jackson pointed to his ear. The secret wasn't about seeing. He explained that he'd heard the wagon's axle creaking, even from that far away. He told Encrid that if you can hear everything around you, you can predict what's going to happen next. Encrid was stunned. He hadn't even heard the wagon get close, let alone a tiny sound like that. He finally understood. You don't need to see to sense what's around you. Jackson told him to just keep trying to listen to his surroundings, to sharpen his senses, and learn to pick out individual sounds. Encrid was surprised by the detailed explanation, noting that Jackson usually seemed too lazy to even answer him properly. Jackson didn't deny it. He said he was lazy. But, he explained, it was better to do this than to have Encrid constantly following him around. As he turned to leave, Jackson looked at his squad leader one last time. He could see it clearly now. Encrid wasn't going to give up. Night fell over the camp. Everything was quiet. Encrid lay there, thinking. He had hit his second wall. This time, it was a faceless death, an assassin who struck from the shadows. He knew there was only one way to survive this. He had to learn to sense them before they could strike. So he began to practice. He closed his eyes and just listened. He focused, picking out the sounds one by one, the steady footsteps of the patrol, the crackle of the torches. But somewhere in all that noise, the real threat was moving. He strained to hear it, trying to pinpoint exactly where the assassin was. The assassin moved without a sound, a shadow in the night. Encrid kept his eyes closed, desperately searching for the sound of the attacker. Then, a tiny glint of light flashed from the darkness. Before he could even react, a needle was in his neck. He had failed again. He woke up back in his room. While real heroes like Cypress were winning battles, he felt like he hadn't taken a single step forward, but his body remembered everything. The experience of learning the heart of the beast, the feeling of every stab, it was all still there. That's when his frustration vanished, replaced by a familiar grin. Jackson started to explain his secret. He said you can learn a lot from sound alone. You can figure out where something is just by listening to how loud and from what direction the sound comes. He told Encrid that if he got good enough, his ears would basically become a second pair of eyes. To prove his point, Jackson snapped his fingers right next to Encrid's head. He explained that every sound is like a wave, spreading out in all directions. The world is filled with thousands of these sound waves all mixed together. The whole trick, he said, was learning how to pick out one single wave from all that chaos. So Encrid started to practice. The camp was full of noise, soldiers talking, training, just living. He closed his eyes and tried to do what Jackson said. He had to listen to every sound, figure out what it was, and then separate it from everything else. He focused on the flags flapping nearby. To him, it just sounded like one big flag. He tried to guess how many there were. 7, 10, he couldn't tell. This was going to be harder than he thought. He kept practicing. Soon, he could pick out the footsteps of soldiers walking by. He could tell exactly how many there were and how far away they were, just from the sound. He lay there with his eyes closed, letting the familiar sounds of the camp wash over him like waves. But then he started picking up the unfamiliar sounds, too. Small things, like a bird landing on a flagpole. Encrid opened his eyes. Someone was standing over him. It was Cypress, the hero of the battlefield. He was smiling, and he asked what kind of training this was. Encrid just looked at him, confused by the strange name Cypress had called him. Cypress just laughed. He explained that since Encrid's name was so formal, he thought NC would be fine. He admitted it wasn't great, but said he'd use it if that's what Encrid wanted. Encrid didn't even look at him. He asked if just sitting there like an idiot really looked like training, but Cypress just smiled. He said he knew Encrid wasn't the type to waste his time. Encrid closed his eyes again, sinking back into the world of sound. He focused on the one sound he was trying to find, the sound of a silent blade, and for a second, he felt it, a sharp, familiar pain in his neck. But the vision that flashed through his mind wasn't of his own death. He saw a hooded figure drive a sword straight through Cypress. The memory was so clear, he could see the blood on the blade. He saw the hero of the battlefield fall. This was the wall. It wasn't about saving himself. It was about saving Cypress. The 33rd attempt, another failure. Then the 34th. He still couldn't hear the blade. Failure after failure. No matter what he tried, the result was always the same. But Encrid realized this wasn't a wall he could break with more experience. He wasn't waiting for some lucky break or a flash of insight. The attack would come, silent and fast, just like it always did. He knew what he had to do. He just had to keep doing it, over and over again, until his senses were sharp enough to pick up on everything, even the smallest sound, like the scrape of a bird's talons landing on a spear. He pictured the assassin moving through the night, a silent shadow preparing to strike. Then, his eyes snapped open. A visitor was standing right over him. The man looked genuinely surprised. He admitted he was trying to sneak up and asked how Encrid possibly knew he was there. He put it together, realizing Encrid had been training his perception, not just sitting there wasting time. A small smile crept onto Encrid's face. He remembered the attack that had taken him down over and over again. The silent needle that always found its mark, but not anymore. He didn't see it. He heard it. The faint sound sound of a needle cutting through the air. He twisted his body, and the needle flew right past his face. The assassin couldn't believe it. Before the attacker could even react, Encred was on him, slamming the man to the ground. The assassin was horrified. This wasn't supposed to happen. Encred looked down at him with a cold smile. He told the man that he was no longer just a faceless death. The attacker struggled under Encred's grip, trying to spit out a name. He screamed for someone named Puchana Zeth. Suddenly, a new figure stepped out of the shadows. This had to be Puchana Zeth. He looked at the scene with cold confidence, telling his partner that he could handle Encred himself. His eyes scanned the area as he thought about the others involved in the fight. He remembered his fallen allies and knew that Krang was still out there somewhere. This wasn't just a simple job for him. Back on the ground, Encred knew he couldn't let his guard down for a second. Even though he had the man pinned, he was still an experienced assassin. One mistake would be all it took, and just like that, the assassin made his move. He twisted his arm, pulling a hidden dagger from his sleeve. He lunged upward, but Encred reacted instantly, blocking the blade with his forearm. It sliced right through his sleeve, but that single moment was all the attacker needed. He used the opening to flip Encred over his shoulder, breaking free from his grip. The freed assassin wasted no time, lunging straight for Encred. Encred was in a bad spot, and he knew it. But someone else was watching the whole thing. It was the company commander. The assassin knew this was his only chance. If he didn't stab first, he was going to be the one who didn't survive. He drove the dagger down with everything he had, but a sword flashed out of nowhere, stopping the blade just inches from Encred's throat. Seeing his partner's attack fail, Puchana Zet immediately launched a volley of needles at the commander. The commander had to twist through the air to avoid the sudden storm of needles. Encred could only watch from the ground, completely helpless. But the commander was fast. He brought his sword up, deflecting every single needle. That's when someone else jumped into the fight. A woman in a red cloak moved between the commander and the assassins. She whipped her cloak around with incredible speed. The needles just bounced right off of it, clattering to the floor. The commander stared, completely shocked. He had no idea who she was or why she was helping. Another soldier watched the chaos unfold. He was confused. He thought the woman was an enemy, but she just protected them. He realized this was his chance to make a move. The soldier saw his opening and charged forward, dagger raised. He came down on the hooded assassin from above, but the assassin was ready for him. His face twisted with rage. With a loud clash of steel, he blocked the strike. The soldier couldn't believe it. His ambush had failed. The assassin used the soldier's own force against him, spinning to throw him off balance. The soldier was sent flying backward, tumbling right over the railing. The soldier watched from the balcony as the attacker disappeared into the night. Back inside, Encred told his squad mate that he was pretty sure the assassin was after him. The man looked confused, asking how Encred could possibly know that. Encred laid out his logic. No one would pay an assassin to deal with a low-level soldier like him. The woman in the red cloak just stared at him. She commented on how quick he was on his feet. Her hand moved to the hilt of her dagger. That's when it hit Encred. She had been an ally, but now she couldn't let this be known. She was going to silence any witnesses. He drew his own blade, ready for another fight. Just then, a blonde-haired officer stepped forward and told the woman he had a favor to ask. Encred watched from the background, silent. He looked her in the eyes and said he didn't want anyone to die today. Encred listened, his expression unreadable. The woman in the red cloak bowed her head, agreeing to his terms. The officer then motioned to a man in a nearby bed. He explained that the platoon commander wasn't dead yet and would be fine since they had an antidote. That caught Encred's attention, so she had knowledge about antidotes. With that settled, the officer said they needed to clean up the mess. It would be a problem if anyone found out an assassin had been there. Encred spoke up, asking if everything would be fine as long as they left no traces. He told them there was an easy way to handle it. A moment later, the medical tent went up in flames. Soldiers scrambled everywhere, shouting that there was a fire. When the soldiers arrived, they found 2 survivors outside the wreckage. He coughed from the smoke. With the tent destroyed, all proof of the assassin was gone. Encred played his part, lying amongst the chaos. He knew the army would handle the rest of the cleanup. Later that night, the blonde officer and the woman walked away from the base, their business finished. As they walked, the woman pointed out that the officer would be dead if Encrid hadn't slowed the assassin down. The officer asked if Encrid was the reason she changed her mind. She admitted he was. He smiled, remarking on how interesting Encrid was, and the woman seemed to agree. The officer admitted that he'd been trying to avoid what he had to do. He thought about Encrid, who never stopped pushing himself, no matter what. He continued on his way through the woods. He smiled, thinking that some of Encrid's stubbornness must have rubbed off on him. He told her that the next time they met, it would be in their proper roles, and with that, they went their separate ways. That night, Encrid found himself back in that familiar dark place. A broken weapon floated in the air before him. He stood there on the dark water, waiting. A voice echoed from the shadows, telling Encrid that he would see the assassin again. Encrid just stared back into the darkness. He was ready to face the repeating day, as many times as it took. But this time was different. He had survived the silent death and woken up to the next morning. Back in the camp, he thought about his training. He could sense almost anything now, but he knew there were still things beyond his perception. He had a lot more work to do. Since he wasn't hurt, he could get back to his duties immediately. He turned to the man he'd pulled from the fire, but the soldier didn't look grateful at all. He just asked why Encrid had bothered to save him. Encrid was confused. He couldn't figure out why the guy was giving him a hard time for saving his life. He walked past him and gave his answer. It was because they were comrades. He didn't think he needed any other reason. The soldier was left speechless. That simple answer seemed to hit him hard. As Encrid walked away, the soldier he'd saved just watched him go. He muttered to himself, calling Encrid a selfless bastard for helping him after everything. The man caught up and asked if Encrid was heading back to his squad. Encrid told him he was. The soldier told him he was out of luck. He warned him that things were really bad over there. He lowered his voice and explained why. There was a rumor going around that the entire base was cursed. Turns out, he wasn't exaggerating. Back at the squad's area, one of the soldiers was screaming insults at another man. Without another word, he charged forward and tackled him, but the man he attacked just grinned. He seemed to be enjoying the chaos. The whole place erupted into a massive fight. Someone in the crowd yelled that the crazy squad was at it again, and it was all because their leader wasn't there to keep them in line. The fight was so wild. One soldier was thrown straight through a tent. The others were screaming for everyone to stay away, warning that these guys would tear apart anyone who got close. Ragna landed a solid punch right across Rem's face, but Rem just took the hit and sent Ragna flying with a punch of his own. That's when Rem pulled out his axe, threatening to split Ragna's skull open. The crowd panicked, yelling that he had a weapon. Ragna drew his own sword, ready to fight back. He was screaming for someone to stop them, wondering where the other squad members were. Encrid watched the chaos unfold. He told the soldier with him that he wasn't sure if the base was cursed, but these guys were definitely his own personal curse. He finally yelled at them to stop. The two fighters looked up, surprised to see their squad leader. One of them joked, asking if he was dead yet. Encrid just sighed and told them that while he wasn't dead, they were going to drive him crazy. It was early morning and he was still in bed. Suddenly, his eyes shot open. A soldier was standing over his bed. The man apologized, saying he was trying to leave quietly, and asked if he'd woken him up. But Encrid told him not to worry. He was about to get up and train anyway. The soldier was impressed, noting that Encrid's senses were already getting sharp. Encrid just told him he'd been practicing. The man told him to keep it up, saying the skill would be useful. After all, with winter approaching, there wouldn't be many battles, so he got right to it. He was out there as the sun was just starting to rise. Suddenly, a voice called out, greeting him as the squad leader. Encrid turned to see who it was, Auden. He was doing push-ups with a massive boulder on his back. Encrid asked if he was just returning from his own workout, commenting that he was keeping busy. Auden stomped his foot, telling Encrid that his dedication was good. He explained that a well-trained body is a powerful weapon all on its own. He joked that with enough work, Encrid's body should at least be tough enough to take a kick from a frog, but he pointed out that Encrid was still too thin and had to keep training. Encrid thought that maybe Auden was just ridiculously big, but he agreed to try. But before he could explain, a loud crash echoed from one of the nearby tents. Inside, another soldier was kicking Ragna, screaming at him to wake up because it was his turn for duty. The man who kicked him was Rem, and he was absolutely furious. Ragna was still on the floor, trying to figure out what just happened. He slowly pushed himself up, grabbing his sword. Suddenly, he just exploded, swinging his blade and screaming insults. Rem didn't hesitate for a second. He grabbed his own axe and swung right back. That's when Encrid and Auden finally stepped in, grabbing both of them to stop the fight. Auden calmly told them that fighting wouldn't solve anything, but Rem wasn't having it. He pointed at Ragna and complained that his laziness was going to starve the entire squad. Auden cut straight to the point. He told Ragna that if it was his turn for duty, he needed to get cooking. Ragna finally gave in. Rem just grumbled at him, saying he shouldn't have made a scene if he was going to do it anyway. Ragna shoved his hand away, telling him to back off because he smelled bad. Encrid stepped in, sniffing the air. He said the food smelled good and told Rem to stop looking for a fight. Rem just grinned. He admitted that the lack of battles was making him antsy. Encrid told him not to take it out on others. Instead, he offered to duel him. So, under the dark, cloudy sky, they prepared to fight. The duel started, and Encrid swung his sword with everything he had. Rem yelled that Encrid needed to learn how to take a hit better. His axe came down hard, but Encrid blocked it, sparks flying from the impact. But Encrid was calm. He was using the heart of the beast to keep his cool under the pressure. Rem swung his axe again, trying to overpower him. He used his hearing to track the attack, blocking it perfectly. He gripped his sword, ready to use the one move he had practiced while dying hundreds of times. He was going to use the stab that had tormented him for so long. As Rem swung, Encrid saw his chance. He ducked under the axe and lunged forward with a perfect thrust. The sword drove forward, but Rem caught it on the handle of his axe. The attack was stopped cold. Before Encrid could pull back, Rem used his raw strength to pin the blade against his own body. The pressure was insane. Encrid gritted his teeth, trying to hold his ground. Then Rem slammed his shoulder forward, throwing Encrid completely off balance. Rem looked down at him, clearly unimpressed. He said he was expecting more, especially after all the progress Encrid had made recently. He asked why he was being so boring all of a sudden. That one stab was getting old, and he wanted to see something new. Encrid knelt there, catching his breath. He looked at his sword, and a thought seemed to click into place. He finally understood. He told himself that he was different now. He could feel everything 100 times better now. He challenged Rem to come at him again, promising to take him down this time. Rem watched him, thinking to himself that Encrid's skills were still terrible. But there was something about the look in Encrid's eyes that he just couldn't get tired of. He told Encrid he could talk big after he actually managed to land a hit. The two of them stood facing each other, ready for the next round. The rain poured down on the encampment, but they didn't seem to notice. Encrid watched the rain pour down. The weather had been strange lately, starting and stopping without any warning. The non-stop rain was getting to everyone. One of the soldiers complained that he'd been wet for so long, he felt like mushrooms were going to grow on his feet. While some complained, others found a moment of quiet. Ragna was asleep, and Auden was kneeling beside him, lost in thought. Suddenly, Kreis burst in, absolutely furious. He yelled about how many times he'd had to cancel his duels because of the rain. He was so fed up, he said he'd believe it if someone told him the whole encampment was cursed. Encrid looked at him, confused by the talk of a curse. Kreis couldn't believe his squad leader hadn't heard the rumors spreading through the camp. Encrid thought back and remembered hearing something about it. A soldier named Vengeance had been telling people that their encampment was cursed. Kreis explained everything. The weather was weird, casualties were up, and things were catching on fire for no reason. He said the scout squad was hit the worst. Jack, Bo, and Rotten were all hurt. That's why people were so sure they were cursed. Kreis admitted he didn't really believe they were cursed. He just figured the strange weather was making everyone jumpy and fueling the rumors. Encrid wasn't worried. He knew the higher-ups wouldn't let something like this slide. Kreis then asked why he was just standing at the entrance to the tent. Encrid told him he was training his senses. He couldn't understand why Encrid would train in the middle of a heavy rainstorm. Encrid explained that the rain was the whole point. While Kreis was confused, another soldier wrapped in a blanket overheard their conversation. He spoke up, saying it was actually a good way to train, and that Encrid was doing well. He watched Encrid with a look of approval. Encrid stood outside, ignoring the noise from the tent. Kreis started yelling at him again, complaining that he was being rude and that it was so loud inside he couldn't even hear the rain. Meanwhile, Auden was talking to Ragna. He offered to look at his stance, saying there were ways to train even while lying down. The veteran soldier who'd been watching Encrid spoke up again. He looked around the tent and said that everyone had noticed it. Kreis looked up from his book, his expression thoughtful. doubtful. Auden just smiled softly to himself. Even Ragna seemed to be lost in thought about it. The veteran continued, talking about what he'd seen. He was talking about Encred. Everyone in the squad had noticed the change in their leader. Meanwhile, in the command tent, an officer was giving orders to keep the soldiers in check. Another commander suggested they send out a scouting party before winter arrived, asking if anyone had ideas. That's when the female commander brought up a name, the leader of the 444th squad. The other officer scoffed at the idea. He called the man useless and dumb, worried he'd just slow everyone down. But she disagreed, saying he might bring about unexpected results. The man asked what made her so sure. She just called it a fairy's instinct, and with that, the decision was made. Sometime later, Encred was called into the commander's tent. She had just given him his new orders. He was being sent to the scouts, and he couldn't quite believe it. Back in his own tent, the question started immediately. One of his men asked if he'd done something to make the company commander angry. Encred didn't have an answer. Cross pushed, asking why else the commander would pick him specifically for such a dangerous job. A dark thought crossed his mind. He wondered if this was her way of getting rid of him, especially now that some guy named Krang was gone. Rem looked up at him, his expression serious. He asked if it was true, if he was really going. Rem offered to help him get out of it. Coming from him, that meant trouble. Encred told him he couldn't just use an axe on a superior officer. Rem tried to play innocent, but Encred reminded him he had a history of doing exactly that. Then Auden started praying loudly, begging for their precious squad leader to be spared. Encred had no idea what was going on with his men. That's when Ragna spoke up from his bed. He offered to go in Encred's place. Encred immediately shot him down. He said anyone else could maybe go, but not Ragna. He was worried the swordsman would just get himself lost. Another voice cut in, asking if the mission was to scout the tall grass fields. It was Jackson. He told Encred to pay close attention to the sounds of the grass to detect an ambush. But Rem exploded, yelling at Jackson to stop teaching Encred his sneaky tricks. He thought about what would happen if he left. Without him there to keep the peace, his men would just start fighting each other. He wasn't sure if leaving them was the right thing to do, but he knew he was the best person for this job. There was no one else better suited for it. He remembered his early days in the army. Because of his poor skills, he was constantly moved from one unit to another, just filling in spots, the only place he ever felt useful. Suddenly, Rem exploded in anger, swinging his axe. Jackson didn't hesitate, lunging forward with his own blade. Someone stepped between them. They were ready to go for the throat, but Encred was standing right in the middle, perfectly calm, stopping the fight before it could even start. He knew the only place he'd ever felt useful was as the leader of this squad of leftovers. He calmly told them to give it a rest. The axe wielder looked at his squad leader, asking if he was brave or just stupid. Another soldier told the swordsman he should be thanking Encred. The swordsman just scoffed, saying the other guy would have been taken down first anyway. But Encred knew the truth. His men were incredibly skilled, and the army couldn't afford to lose them. Compared to them, he wasn't much of a loss at all. He was completely honest with himself. He knew exactly where he stood in terms of skill, and because of that, he knew there was only one thing to do: get better. This scouting mission would put him right on the front lines. It was the perfect chance to spend all his time training his senses. As soon as he joined the scouting party, their leader called him out, referring to him as the leftover squad leader. He made it clear that even though they had the same rank, he was in charge here. If Encred had a problem, he was ready to fight over it. The other scouts laughed along, sneering at Encred. They called his squad a bunch of outcasts, and wondered if he even knew how to hold a sword. The scout leader just smirked, adding that Encred was useless. He said the only reason his squad was still running was because of his men. With that settled, he turned to his men and gave his orders. He yelled that if they met the enemy, they were to bash their skulls in. Encred listened silently. They were so loud. It was obvious they didn't understand the first thing about scouting. He realized their leader was completely green. Just then, one of the men found tracks on the ground. The squad leader knelt down to get a better look. He recognized them immediately. They were new tracks. A wide grin spread across his face. He completely forgot about the mission and told his men to follow the tracks, excited about having a barbecue that night. Encred knew that Noose always traveled in large groups. He couldn't believe the squad leader was actually planning to fight them. The man was completely clueless. But another scout just scoffed. He pointed out that they weren't new tracks at all. They belonged to a gazelle. The squad leader was left speechless. That's when the scout who corrected him walked over to Encred. He introduced himself as Henri and commented on how obnoxious their leader was. Turns out, Henri used to be a hunter in a mountain town, so he didn't care much for the squad leader. He and Encred started talking and quickly became friends. Henri started teaching him the basics of being a hunter, which was actually really useful. He promised to show him how to find animal paths the next day. They spent the entire day searching for Noose that were never there. By nightfall, the squad leader was fuming, still insisting he'd been right. He was getting desperate for any kind of result. Nearby, Encred lay awake, listening to the man's complaint. After a long walk, they finally reached their destination. The squad leader announced that this was the place they were supposed to recon, a location called Green Pearl. He added that most people just called it the uselessly tall grass field, and when they looked, they could see why. The grass stretched out before them like a green wall, so tall you couldn't see anything inside. The leader didn't care. He ordered them to cross the field, find the enemy's scouting party, and bring them back as prisoners for a reward. Henri looked uneasy. He asked Encred if they were really going in, pointing out that they were only supposed to scout up to this point. Encred just looked back at him. It didn't matter. It was the squad leader's command. The squad pushed their way through the tall grass. The squad leader watched from the front, thinking the difficult path would make anyone complain. But he was surprised. Encred wasn't complaining at all. He was taking this whole thing very seriously. That's when Encred noticed something. He pointed out that there were no animal droppings anywhere. Henri looked worried as Encred explained the problem. In a field this full of food, no animals meant one thing. Something big had scared them all away. Just then, something massive moved nearby. Encred's eyes went wide. A huge black panther had appeared right beside him. His focus sharpened instantly. He was ready for a fight, but the panther wasn't the threat. Suddenly, Henri screamed for everyone to get down. It was too late. Bolts flew out of the grass, and his men started dropping. He looked up, his face filled with panic. It was the enemy. An entire scouting party had been hiding in the grass, waiting for them. They had to run. The whole squad turned and tried to get away, but there was nowhere to go. The ambushers were on them in seconds, swords drawn. Encred watched helplessly as one of his men was cut down right in front of him. It was a slaughter. They were completely surrounded, with no chance of escape. And just like that, he woke up again, lying in the tall grass. The day had reset. This time, he focused, trying to use the listening technique Jackson had taught him. He knew it could be useful here, but there was a problem. The technique was working too well. He could hear everything. The wind, the insects, every rustle of grass. It was so much noise that he couldn't figure out which sounds mattered. Before he could sort through the chaos, the bolts were already flying. He died again. Turns out, just knowing about the ambush wasn't enough to actually avoid it. He woke up again. This time, he tried to warn his squad leader directly. The man just got furious, threatening to cut his head off and yelling that there was no way the men would listen to him. Encred realized it was pointless. He couldn't save people who wouldn't listen. He'd have to find a way to get out of this by himself. So he tried running. He screamed a warning about the ambush, hoping to at least give the others a chance. But it was no use. He tried a different path, but the enemies were there too. He was cut down again. It didn't matter. He knew he'd just wake up and find another way. He died again and again. But with every death, he learned something new about the enemy's plan. He found out there were about 20 crossbowmen hiding to the east. That loop ended with him full of arrows. So the next time, he tried going north to avoid them. Turns out, a whole squad of spearmen was waiting there instead. No matter which way he turned, he was completely trapped. He lay on the ground, bleeding out from the arrows in his back. In the distance, he could hear the enemy soldiers shouting, making sure no one was left alive. Even then, his mind was working. He noticed their uniforms were dyed green. This wasn't a random encounter. They had been waiting for them. His last thought was a question. Why go to all this trouble for an empty field? There had to be something here worth protecting. The war felt endless, a constant cycle of fighting and dying. And then, his eyes shot open. He was back. He looked over and saw his squad leader, shouting the same order as before. The man was yelling about crossing the field to capture prisoners for a reward. Completely unaware, he was leading them all into a trap. Encred stared at his squad leader, but his mind was elsewhere. He knew what was coming. He'd already tried to cross this field dozens of times, and every single time, it ended the same way. No one made it out alive. Still, he couldn't let it go. Those Aspen soldiers were hiding something important here. He had to find out what it was. Then a thought hit him. If he just gave up on this mission, he wouldn't have to die anymore. This whole day could finally end. But he immediately pushed the idea away. He wasn't going to run from this wall. His hesitation didn't go unnoticed. The squad leader started shouting, demanding to know what they were waiting for. One of the soldiers tried to calm his friend down, telling him to just ignore the leader's attitude. But the other man was furious. He said he was done tolerating an idiot and then mocked his squad mate for defending their leader. That was the last straw. The soldier grabbed the angry man's arm, stopping him cold. He announced that he was done playing this game. The squad leader glared at Encrid, furious. He accused him of disobeying orders. Encrid knew he couldn't just disobey. He wouldn't survive this place alone. So he made his choice. He announced that from now on, he would be giving the commands. He promised to use everyone's strengths to get them all out alive. The squad leader, Andrew Gardner, was seething. Encrid had seen this play out before. Andrew, Henri, and one other soldier always survived the longest. That other soldier was the most skilled fighter in the squad. But since he was always stuck to Andrew's side, Encrid figured he had to be some kind of bodyguard. Andrew didn't hesitate. He told Encrid if he wanted command, he'd have to earn it. He drew his sword, ready for a fight. Encrid watched him carefully. He realized a normal soldier wouldn't have a bodyguard. Andrew was clearly well trained, but his posture showed he had little real experience. He was probably some rich lord's son. But then he remembered the night before. He'd seen how stressed Andrew was, desperate to get results. A rich kid wouldn't care that much. Something else was going on here. Andrew mocked him, guessing he was some fallen noble. He called him a pathetic loser who got his rank without ever training. Encrid just looked at him. He explained that he couldn't follow his orders anymore because he was different. Andrew started screaming about having a mission to fulfill, but Encrid cut him right off, telling him he talked too much. He gestured for Andrew to come at him, claiming he wouldn't even need his sword. That was all it took. Andrew charged forward, furious. Encrid sidestepped the attack easily. He knew Andrew was skilled, but his pride was making him careless, and that carelessness gave Encrid the perfect opening. In one quick move, he chopped down on Andrew's wrist, knocking the sword right out of his hand. But he wasn't done yet. Before Andrew could even react, Encrid brought his hand down hard. Andrew's eyes widened in disbelief. He never saw it coming. With his other hand, Encrid grabbed Andrew's head and slammed him straight into the ground. He was furious, spitting dirt and saliva. He'd been completely humiliated. Encrid stood over him, not even breathing hard. The fight was over. The other soldiers couldn't believe it. They whispered to each other, shocked that the guy they thought was a nobody had just taken down their leader in one move. He turned to face the rest of them. He announced that from now on, he was in command and dared anyone to challenge him. No one said a word. They just stared, completely stunned by the sudden change. One of the soldiers, a man with a goatee, just watched him with a grim look. Andrew was still on the ground, completely furious. The soldier with the goatee straightened up. The decision was made. Encrid looked ahead calmly. For him, this was just step one. With their old leader defeated, the rest of the squad fell in line and followed Encrid into the tall grass. But they were uneasy. One of the men wondered what this new leader was even thinking, leading them deeper into danger. That's when Encrid suddenly broke the silence. He turned to one of his men and asked him what his dream was. The soldier, Henri, was completely caught off guard. He couldn't understand why Encrid would ask something like that now. Henri answered honestly. He said he wanted to marry a beautiful woman who runs a flower shop. Encrid listened, then told him that to do that, he had to survive the day. He then turned to another man and asked the same question. The soldier explained that his lover had just had a baby. Encrid repeated the same simple logic. If he didn't want his child to grow up without a father, he had to make it out alive. He asked two more. One wanted to save up and start his own business. The other just wanted to go home. Finally, Encrid turned to Andrew. The former leader said quietly that he needed to fulfill his mother's last wish. His expression hardened. He declared that his mission was to revive his family's name, House Gardner. Encrid had heard enough. He told them that all their dreams were the same in one important way. To achieve any of them, they first had to make it out of this field alive. He looked back at them, letting the weight of that simple truth settle in. For the first time, they weren't just a group of soldiers. They were a team with one goal. With that, he gave his command. They would make it out of here alive. Every soldier soldiers stood with a new look in their eyes. They finally understood what was at stake. This was Incred's plan. He needed them to act on their own, and nothing was a better teacher than a real threat. He knew the enemy was close, and this time, they wouldn't be the ones running. He pointed to a random spot in the grass and gave Henri an order. He told him to shoot an arrow aimed at head height. Henri was confused, telling him there was nothing there. Incred didn't argue. He just told him to shoot. A second later, Henri let the arrow fly. It slammed into two cloaked figures hiding in the grass. Someone screamed out a warning. It was an ambush. The squad froze, their faces filled with panic. They had walked right into a trap, but instead of retreating, Incred charged forward. He yelled for Andrew to follow him straight into the fight. Andrew gritted his teeth. He couldn't believe it. Incred had just turned their certain death into a chance to fight with the advantage. The hidden soldiers were completely stunned. They expected their targets to scatter and run, not charge straight at them. Following Incred's lead, Andrew took down one of the ambushers instantly. Incred's blade was already brutal. He knew they had to do more than just survive. They needed to find the rest of the enemy and ambush them first. As Andrew tore through the grass, one of the enemy soldiers spotted him. He screamed for his men to focus their attack and take him down, but Andrew was too fast. He closed the distance in an instant and silenced the soldier for good. Incred watched the chaos unfold. This was all part of his plan. He knew that if he brought Andrew to the front, the enemy would focus on him, drawing out their hidden forces. Andrew was a storm in the tall grass. The enemy started with 12 men, but he had already cut that number down to 8. The soldiers screamed in pure panic, yelling for help. They were supposed to be the hunters. Now, they were the ones caught in a trap. The whole field was filled with the sound of running feet and rustling grass as the fight spread. His men looked back at him, waiting for the command. Incred's expression was ice cold. He gave them a simple order: take them all down. With that, the fight became a slaughter. Andrew didn't hesitate for a second, moving on to the next target. But as the battle raged, Incred was thinking, in a field like this, it should have been hard for them to be found. So why were they discovered first? That's when his hand brushed against something buried in the dirt. It was the answer. Suddenly, an enemy soldier burst through the grass, chasing a large black beast. The creature was incredibly fast, and the soldier screamed in frustration as it dodged his attacks. He lunged forward, trying to finish it with his spear. And that's when it all clicked for Incred. He realized that in the first timeline, the enemy soldiers were chasing this same beast. They only found his squad by pure chance. This time, their focus on the animal made them blind to his ambush. The beast had accidentally helped them, and he decided he wouldn't let it by. A moment later, one of his men yelled out that the fight was over. They had taken care of everyone. Incred didn't waste a second. He told everyone they were moving out immediately. The Black Panther, now safe, followed close behind. The animal's eyes were sharp and intelligent. It seemed to understand exactly what was happening. As they pushed through the field, Incred thought about the loops. Even after so many tries, he couldn't save everyone. But this time, 6 of them had made it. It was the best result yet. But the enemy was still out there, hiding in the tall grass. This was Incred's advantage. After repeating the day so many times, he knew exactly where every single enemy soldier was. He pointed to the right, telling them to change direction. He knew that if they went straight, 30 crossbowmen were waiting to wipe them out. His plan was simple: avoid the big fights and use quick ambushes to take out the threats that would slow them down. The spearmen who had chased them in every other loop were the first to go. The fight was taking its toll. Andrew was clearly pushing himself too hard, and he knew that once it got dark, finding a way out of this field would be nearly impossible. The sun was already getting low. They had to get out of there before they lost the light completely. But when Incred told them to move forward, Andrew stopped him. He pointed out that they were going deeper into the field, not towards the exit. Incred just said he knew, and that this was the right direction. He wasn't taking any arguments. He just told them to follow him. The rest of the squad was completely stunned. They couldn't understand the plan. That's when Andrew snapped. He put his sword right to Incred's throat and told him to start making sense. Incred didn't even flinch. He told Andrew he had no intention of leading them to their deaths. He made it clear that he would find a way for them to live, even if he had to go through Andrew to do it. But Andrew wasn't backing down. He argued that after all the noise they'd made, the enemy had surely swarmed their only way out. He demanded to know why he should trust Incred's path instead. Andrew held his sword steady. He told Incred he needed to make one thing perfectly clear. He wanted to survive, too. This wasn't about challenging him, it was about getting out alive. As he watched Encred, Andrew realized he'd been completely wrong. He had assumed their new leader was just useless trash. He thought Encred would be just like his own father, a man who gave up and wasted everything their family had built. But that wasn't it at all. In fact, Encred reminded him of someone else entirely. The memory came rushing back, sitting by his mother's bedside. She told him their family's legacy was probably finished. But even as she was dying, she had one last hope for him. She wanted him to become a person who leads others just by being there, someone who could earn trust and rebuild their family. And in that instant, Andrew realized he was staring at the very man his mother had described. Encred looked right at him, his eyes full of confidence. He made a simple promise: trust him, and they would all survive this. Andrew looked back at his men, then locked eyes with Encred. He finally made his decision, telling him that he trusted him. For the first time, Andrew addressed him by his proper title, Captain Encred. One of the other soldiers still seemed hesitant, but his friend quickly shut him down. He reminded him that Encred was their captain now. Andrew agreed, stating firmly that a squad follows the orders of its captain. The other man went silent, his argument finished. With his authority established, Encred gave his first command. He told them to follow him quietly and wait for his signal. The entire squad moved as one, disappearing into the tall grass. This was the first part of his plan to escape. They weren't going to run. They were going to ambush the enemy and break the encirclement themselves. They moved like shadows through the field, but the ambush was only step one. Encred already had the second step figured out. The sun was setting as they pushed through the tall grass. Every step had to be silent. One mistake would give them away. Then they saw it. The field was covered in arrows, a sign of a brutal fight. The other soldiers froze in horror. But for Encred, this was exactly what he was looking for. This was the critical point he'd found after dying dozens of times. The men looked at each other, the reality of their situation finally sinking in. He knew their window of opportunity was small. His plan would only work at this exact time, in this exact place. Following his lead, the entire squad took cover in the grass, waiting for the right moment. And that's when they saw them. The enemy soldiers were hidden just feet away, their weapons ready. But as they moved, it became clear just how dangerous this was. They were walking a narrow path through an entire army hiding in the grass. The other soldiers were sweating, barely holding it together. But Encred looked completely calm, like he knew exactly where he was going. They followed him deeper into the field, trusting him completely. Every rustle of the grass made them jump. They were surrounded, and they knew it. But this was all part of his plan. Everything had gone exactly as he'd foreseen. Now, there was just one last step. As the sun finally set, the field was covered in darkness. That's when they arrived. They had captured 3 enemy soldiers. Encred finally understood why they had always failed to escape this field before. The other soldiers couldn't believe it. After everything they'd been through, all their hard work to escape had led them right here. They had stumbled directly into the Aspen Army's main camp. But Encred saw the truth. The Aspen soldiers weren't just hunting them. They were hiding something in this field, and they were trying to silence anyone who might find it. A quick look at their camp told you everything you needed to know about them. The poles were decorated with the remains of their victims. And that's when a new plan started to form in his head. He wondered what would happen if something more important than catching them suddenly occurred. With his mind made up, he gave the order to move out. He was sure of it. If they could force the enemy to protect their secret, a path for their own escape would definitely appear. Mac knew it was a bad situation. With the moon hidden by clouds, they were completely lost. He realized that right now, their only choice was to trust the squad leader. Putting his doubts aside, he raised his sword and sliced through the wall of a tent. The plan was officially in motion. Mac watched in disbelief. Encred wasn't sneaking around. He was just tearing right through the tent walls. But when they rushed inside, it was completely empty. The men followed Encred, completely confused. How could he possibly know which paths were safe? It felt insane, just running through the middle of the enemy camp like this. But Mac started to realize something was strange. They were deep inside the camp, but they hadn't seen a single enemy soldier. It didn't make any sense. That's when they saw them. The enemy soldiers were all gathered in one spot, completely unaware of their presence. Encred held up a hand, telling them to wait. Encred explained that this wasn't his first time here. He'd snuck into this camp dozens of times, and he remembered what happened when he first found their flag. The moment he touched it, the entire base had turned on him. He told Mac that the flag was the real secret the Aspen soldiers were hiding in the grass. Protecting it was their most important mission. Mac's eyes widened as the plan clicked into place. If that flag were to catch on fire, he couldn't understand how Encrid knew about it in the first place. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. Then he remembered who appointed this nobody to lead their squad. It all started to seem like it was planned from the very beginning. Encrid's voice cut through his thoughts, explaining that the enemy soldiers would be too busy protecting the flag to notice them. It finally made sense. The reason Encrid had suddenly taken control and led them straight into the enemy camp. This was all part of a secret mission. Encrid laid out the rest of the plan. While the enemy was distracted by the fire, his squad would make their escape. He told them they would split into two groups. One would be the bait, drawing all the attention, while the other would be responsible for starting the fire. Without hesitation, Mac volunteered to be part of the bait group. Encrid was a little surprised. Mac had done nothing but complain until now, but suddenly he was on board. Encrid figured it was for the best. He thought about all the times he'd died trying this before. He had dragged his squad into the Aspen camp many times, but he'd never had this many soldiers with him. This time felt different. This was the best today he'd ever had. A feeling of confidence washed over him. He knew he could do it, and just like that, the plan was in motion. An arrow flew through the night, striking one of the guards. The camp exploded into chaos. As guards yelled about intruders, Mac charged forward, leading the bait team right into the heart of the enemy. The bait team's charge worked perfectly. The enemy soldiers swarmed them, completely focused on the attack. While the camp was distracted, Encrid sprinted toward his target. He was determined to succeed this time and finally move on to tomorrow. He reached out and grabbed the heavy torch. With the fire in his hand, he felt a surge of confidence, but just as he turned, a huge shadow fell over him. A massive enemy soldier stood in his way, ready to strike. The soldier swung his giant weapon down with incredible force. Encrid met the blow with the metal torch. The impact was so strong, it nearly knocked him off his feet. The enemy soldier looked stunned. He hadn't even heard Encrid approach. Just then, someone else flew past him, grabbing the torch. It was one of his own men, moving with incredible speed. Encrid stared at the enemy. He'd lived this day dozens of times, but he had never seen this soldier before. This was a new, dangerous problem, but his focus narrowed. A new enemy didn't matter if the plan failed. The soldier looked around, completely thrown off. He couldn't understand where such a strong opponent had come from, but Encrid knew something else was wrong. His team was late. The enemy was still searching for the source of the chaos. Then, chaos erupted. The tents were going up in flames. The enemy soldiers finally realized there were more intruders. They started shouting and charging forward to deal with them, but one of Encrid's men yelled out the plan. He told everyone to focus on the fire first. Mac had baited most of the enemies away, while he'd drawn the attention of the rest, giving Andrew time to set the tents ablaze. With the diversion in full swing, Encrid had only one thought. Now, he just had to get out of there alive. As an enemy soldier lunged at him, a lesson from his training echoed in his mind. All attacks start from the feet. He remembered the instruction clearly. Kick against the ground to push your body forward. He watched the soldier's every move, his focus absolute. And then he saw it. There was a tiny gap in the man's defense, and that was all Encrid needed. Encrid's blade sank deep into the soldier's chest. The soldier's eyes went wide, shocked that he'd been hit. He knew he had improved a lot. This one move proved it. He pulled his sword back, and the soldier began to collapse. But then, he realized something was wrong. A sharp pain shot through his side. The soldier he'd stabbed was still standing. He grunted, admitting that his own counterattack was the most perfect stab he could manage. Encrid looked down. He had been so sure of his victory. The soldier just looked down at him, unimpressed. He called Encrid's best effort weak, and in that moment, Encrid knew it was true. At his current level, there was just no way to beat this guy. He thought about how hard he'd fought just to get here. He remembered surviving the ambush in the fields and all the times he had to die to finally make it through. He really thought he'd beaten all the challenges for this today. But then a new thought hit him. He realized the soldier wasn't the problem. The real wall of the day was something else entirely. If he challenged that man now, he would just die again, and it wouldn't even be a real fight. He thought about what would happen if he died here. He'd have to go through it all again. again. The escape, the fighting, the endless cycle of meaningless deaths. The soldier just watched him, trying to figure out what was going on. Then he saw it, a faint smile on Encrid's face. He couldn't believe it and demanded to know if he was actually laughing. But Encrid wasn't just laughing. Something had clicked in his mind. He looked up, a wild grin spreading across his face, and told the soldier that he was going to beat him. The soldier was furious. He swore he would cut Encrid to pieces. But Encrid was done talking. He just got into his stance, ready to fight. This man was his new wall, and he was going to overcome it. Sparks flew as Encrid held his ground, somehow managing to block the full force of the soldier's attack. The soldier pushed down with all his might, trying to break through Encrid's defense. He couldn't believe it. Just a moment ago, this guy was on the verge of death. Now he was blocking his best attack, but the force was too much. Encrid was thrown back, hitting the ground hard. But Encrid didn't stay down. From the ground, he swung his sword up in a wild arc. It was a move born from pure instinct, a last-ditch effort to turn the tables. The soldier was stunned. He couldn't believe Encrid was attacking from that position, but his surprise lasted only a second. He quickly moved to defend himself. Their swords met again, the soldier easily parrying the attack. That's when Encrid realized he was completely outmatched. The soldier's movements were too fast, too precise. He couldn't find a single opening to counterattack. The difference in their skill was just too big. He was being completely overwhelmed. The soldier just kept coming, giving Encrid no time to even think. The soldier pushed down with all his weight, and Encrid's arms started to buckle. He was just too strong, relentlessly pushing forward and giving Encrid no room to breathe. Then, instead of using his sword, he just slapped Encrid across the face. Encrid couldn't believe it. The guy didn't even think he was worth using a blade on, but that disrespect just lit a fire in him. He lashed out with a desperate kick, aiming right for the soldier's hand. But the soldier saw it coming and sent him flying back with a powerful kick of his own. Meanwhile, the fire they'd set as a diversion was quickly spreading, turning the whole area into an inferno. Encrid parried the blow, his eyes locked on his opponent. The fire was growing wild. One of the soldiers realized someone had poured oil everywhere, making the flames spread even faster. The blaze was now heading straight for their flag. One of the soldiers screamed at his platoon commander, trying to snap him out of it. He was furious, yelling that the commander didn't seem to understand what was at stake. But the commander wasn't listening. He was staring at Encrid, realizing this guy wasn't going to be an easy fight. Encrid just held his ground, his grip tight on his sword. He was completely focused. Nothing else mattered. The commander looked him in the eye and promised they would meet again. And with that, he turned his back and walked away. Encrid was stunned. He couldn't understand why the commander would back off so easily. As the commander ordered his men to fall back, a thought hit Encrid. Was this guy not the true wall he was supposed to overcome? He gripped his sword. If the commander wasn't the challenge, it just meant he still wasn't ready. He had to improve. He had to get much, much stronger. Suddenly, a shout pulled him from his thoughts. One of his squad members was rushing towards him. One of his men screamed at him, trying to snap him out of it. Another soldier looked back, his face filled with worry as he yelled for his squad leader. Meanwhile, the enemy commander walked away from the flames without a second thought. He didn't look back. His mind was already somewhere else. The order was given, and the soldiers began to pull back. The battle was over, at least for now. Encrid and his men ran as fast as they could, leaving the burning camp behind them. After finding a brief moment to rest, one of his men reported their losses. Some of the squad didn't make it. There were only 5 of them left. One of the soldiers looked at his blood-stained sword, nervously asking if the enemy would send a large force to chase them down. Encrid told him they probably wouldn't, trying to keep everyone calm. Just then, one of the soldiers started coughing hard, struggling to keep up. Turns out, Encrid was wrong. Another soldier looked back in panic as the enemy shouted from behind, ordering their men not to let them escape. There was no time to think. The squad scrambled up the side of a cliff, desperate to get away, but the enemy soldiers were right on their heels, determined to finish the job. Even as they ran, the fighting didn't stop. They had to cut down any enemy that got too close. One by one, they dealt with the soldiers who managed to catch up. Encrid screamed at his men, telling them not to hesitate and to just keep running. One of the soldiers yelled out the plan. They were heading into the territory of wild foxes and snakes, hoping the enemy wouldn't dare to follow them. He looked certain, explaining that he knew a safe hunter's path that would get them through. Encrid didn't waste a second. He told the soldier he trusted him and ordered him to lead the way. They plunged deep into the dark forest. After a while, one of the men realized he couldn't hear anyone chasing them anymore. The plan had worked. For the first time in hours, they were finally in the clear. They ran through the night, deep into the wild. Even the animals of the forest stopped to watch them pass. One of the men caught his breath, saying that without Andrew and Mac's diversion, they never would have gotten away so easily. Another agreed, adding that Henri's knowledge of the terrain was just as important. It took every single one of them working together to make it out. Encrid was exhausted, covered in dirt and blood, but he kept going. He looked up and saw the sun finally starting to rise. They had made it through the night. The whole squad was safe. When they finally stumbled back into their camp, the other soldiers couldn't believe what they were seeing. One of the squad members just collapsed, saying he was done. Encrid clutched his side, feeling the pain, but he had done it. Another today was over, but a new day had already begun. Miles away, at the enemy camp, the mood was completely different. A hooded man stood with a commander who was clearly not happy. He ordered his men to prepare again. He couldn't believe his famous Grey Dog Company had failed to stop a few stragglers. His men were supposed to be the best of the best, yet a small group had broken through their lines, started a fire, and just vanished. The company was named after the Grey Dogs of Aspen. They were known for being incredibly persistent, never letting go of a target they'd chosen. It didn't matter if it was for love or for war. That's why his company was also known as the Persistent Lovers. He turned to one of his soldiers, a huge man named Mitch Hurrier. The commander asked him if the one he fought was strong. Mitch Hurrier insisted that if it hadn't been for the fire, he would have finished his opponent right there. The commander just told him that getting lucky is a skill in itself. Mitch promised himself it wouldn't happen again. Back in his own camp, Encrid was quietly wrapping his hands. He was thinking about the fight. It bothered him that he'd faced a new wall, but couldn't get over it. A part of him really wanted to keep fighting that man. He knew it would happen eventually. Miles away, Mitch Hurrier made a promise to himself. He was going to take that man down with his own two hands. And Encrid felt the exact same way. The Persistent Lovers had set their next target, and he had found his next wall.